This year, I'm excited to kick off what I hope will be a new wave of conversations and practical learnings about how we address gender inequalities in the workplace. For too long, well-meaning efforts have fallen into established silos. The Women's Mentorship Program, the LGBTQ ERG, the African American Talent Pipeline work. If we're going to evolve and achieve new levels of success in the full talent and representation of a diverse workforce, then we need a new way of conceptualizing how gender operates at work. How are we accounting for non-binary inclusion? Gay men counseled to be more masculine to get ahead in their careers. Black queer employees navigating DEI programs. This next session is a conversation with friends and thought leaders on what it will take to engender change at work and ensure that our initiatives are truly intersectional. Thank you all for joining us. I am so excited for this panel. Before we get into the questions, I'd love for each of you to introduce yourselves. Let's begin with you, Bo. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Out and Equal again. I've learned so much from the conference over the years, and my name is Bo Young Lee, for any of those I don't know, and I lead diversity and inclusion at Uber. And this panel, I'm really looking forward to it. It's like a group of old friends.
Thanks so much, Bo. Michael, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Similarly, it's like coming home to Out and Equal. I'm glad to be with you all virtually, and I lead inclusion and diversity at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise.
Wonderful, thanks. Linnea, welcome to Summit.
Oh, good afternoon. Linnea Irvin, president at Coqual. We're a 16-year-old think tank that conducts research and advises companies on diversity, equity, inclusion. This too is a homecoming. I've spent many years over the past decade or so at Out and Equal, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Linnea. It's such a treat to have you. And Jen, welcome to Summit.
Hi, I'm glad to be here. I'm Jen Henderson. I'm a Senior Vice President of Commercial and Institutional Banking at PNC. I'm also, as just recently, a new board member for Out and Equal. So I'm really happy to be here.
And Chris Crespo, welcome to Summit.
Thanks, Dana. Fantastic to be back together with everyone again. So I'm at Ernst & Young, now known as EY, and I've been there about 30 years. I'm a director of diversity and inclusion, but I grew up in the tax practice. So sometimes I still think I'm a tax person converted into an HR person. On the personal side, I'm actually from New Jersey now, and I have 3 young adult triplets that I still think are little kids, but they keep me grounded and keep me current.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris. And I think we actually first met at Out and Equal 2007, perhaps. So again,
I actually went back and counted it up, and 2003 was my first summit. So if my accounting skills are still working well with me, that means this is number 17.
Welcome back to Summit, everyone, and welcome home to Summit. So let's dive right in. And I'd love to start with Bo and Chris. Can you talk about how women and gender inclusion has evolved?
Sure. Since we both kind of started at the same place, Bo, I'll go ahead and start. When we really started talking about gender from a D&I perspective, it really meant women. And so, it was all about women empowerment, fixing women, and that was diversity and inclusion. Now you look at even that component of it, and it's more around women advancement, women in industry groups like women in IT, or even gender neutral benefits, and how gender plays into it from an overall perspective. I think now, as I talk about it, and when you look at how LGBT plays into gender, I'm often leading with how we have to work differently, because 30% of the people coming out of our colleges these days don't identify on the gender binary. And so if we're talking biological sex with male-female language, if we're not sharing or asking for pronouns, if we aren't acknowledging transgender support, then we may inadvertently be keeping 1/3 of the grads and even parents who have those grads from looking at us seriously as a welcoming employer. So I think the definition and the understanding of gender has dramatically changed from when I started 30 years ago at EY to what it is today.
Absolutely. I agree with what Chris just said here, is that the complexity of how we think about gender is really what it's evolved, because you first did have that binary 20, 30 years ago. And then it was all about, to Chris's point, fixing the women, trying to make them more like the men, because you still had that normative, like, cis male model of what leadership was, and how do we make women a bit more like that, and like the whole idea of like leaning in and all of those types of things. You do have that complexity of the intersectionality that comes, that intersectional identity. So, Chris talked about the, fact that most people, a lot of our young people no longer identify in that plurality. And then you have, the intersection of not only gender, but you have then race, ethnicity, you have disability, you have so many other things. And like, you can't just talk about a person as women or men, right? You have to talk about things like Black women and the uniqueness of that, or being a Black trans woman, which also has the uniqueness about that. A strategy that just works for women, by default, if you just create a strategy, let's quote unquote, for women, it will always lead towards the majority of those people, which are white women. That's why so many strategies that have historically been created were for white, cis, straight women. But we know that those strategies don't fundamentally work for people who are either, non-binary, women of color, and so forth. And that's the evolution. And it's been good to see that. But at the same time, when I've seen that complexity rolling in, and if you start engaging people who don't have as much fluency in D&I, they struggle with that complexity. They want it to be that binary again. And I think you see, as much as the conversation has evolved, you also see a lot of pushback to the complexity of the conversation as well.
Mm-hmm. And Bo, I think you're touching on such an important point. So I'll dive right in as well, a little bit off script here. May I ask if you're comfortable sharing, where do you see this pushback? Are you seeing it from, for example, majority men, cisgender men? Are you seeing it from majority women? White, straight, cisgender women who are pushing back against this level of complexity?
Right. I think you get the pushback from anybody who comes from a position of relative privilege, right? So we know that even though white women absolutely struggle with sexism, misogyny, so forth, within any sort of organizational structure, corporate structure, white women have a relative amount of power compared to others, right? White men have privilege and power as compared to other groups. And so for them, they've never been forced to think about the world in a complex way. If you are dealing with a trans Black female with a disability, her entire life is that reality. She fundamentally gets it, right? Because she has to navigate that. Her livelihood, her safety is understanding the intersection of all these identities. But if you're coming from a place of relative privilege, your privilege is that you can be ignorant. And, you don't, and when someone says, no, there's a different reality from yours, it's a struggle. It's a struggle to learn. Like there is a certain intellectual laziness to a lot of people. And I say that for everybody, right? Mm-hmm. I'm an American, and that's a fundamentally privileged place to be, even though I have multiple things like my gender, my immigration status, my race, ethnicity that make me a minority. Being an American is fundamentally a privileged position in the world, and I don't want to be forced to acknowledge that. Same thing, anyone who comes from a relative place of privilege, if you're a cis white female, if you're a cis white male, you can live a world with a relative amount of like ignorance to the reality of everybody else, and it's painful to go through that process. And so I think the resistance comes from anybody who comes from a place of privilege.
But I'm going to say it is the complexity, like you said, that sometimes makes it a journey for some of us. I mean, I easily identified as lesbian from a young age. Yeah. But then as I started becoming more and more aware of people around me, different identities and how that impacted me, I identify as non-binary now. But can I be a lesbian if I'm non-binary? Because lesbian means same-sex loving for women. It gets really complex. So I love it when they have these gender reveal parties. It's like, if only it was that easy to just reveal a gender, right? Right. Because the interaction of how orientation plays off of gender as well gets complicated too.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you're 100% right. I myself, right, I've gone through the journey where I call myself a cisgender, gender nonconforming female. Like, my gender expression is so nonconforming to like the binary female, and it throws people off. And I remember the first time I was pregnant with my first child, And I guess I just didn't talk that much about my life. And I was telling people I got pregnant, and they were like, "Oh, how?" And I was like, "I had sex with my husband." And they're like, "Wait, you have a husband?" I'm like, "Yes, I have a husband." They're like, "Oh, we thought you were a lesbian." And I'm like, "Why would you ever assume that?" But it's interesting. Like, and I myself have like come out as like gender expression nonconforming, even though I'm fully like identify as cis. I fully identify as straight. So it's interesting how the complexity is fundamentally good, I think.
Thanks so much. And I think, Bo, you just illuminated such a powerful point with your personal story, which is that in a lot of workplaces still, folks collapse gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. And it does a disservice to the whole conversation about gender diversity, not just what makes us unique, but also where our commonalities are. So thanks for illuminating that. On this initial question of the evolution of gender and women as organizing principles of inclusion, I would love to hear from Michael and Linnea, who have also, of course, been steeped in this field for some time. Michael, you want to start with what you have seen evolve in the course of your career, and then we'll go to Linnea?
Well, similar to Bo and Chris, the change has been quite adamant, right, around sort of binary thinking, and then evolving into gender as an expression and expanding of the topic. But in addition, I wanted to point out the importance of including and deliberately including cisgender females, because the data is real. And so in that same time period, what has happened is that the majority of chief human resource officers are now female. Now, it's the only C-level position where that can make the case, right? So there's a lot more to work from a gender perspective. But the reality is, and I think, Bo, you picked up on it, there is a measure of power and privilege, and particularly in the field that impacts all of us around policies, practices, and processes that create equitable workplaces for all marginalized communities. So not in deliberately thinking about how to include cisgender straight females into the conversation is amiss, because there are these pressures to simplify. And I think organizationally, we face this challenge around, I can't do everything, so let's focus our energy. So I think this conversation is spot on, because there needs to be a deliberate action to invite them to the table.
Thanks so much, Michael. Linnea.
It's interesting because, the pressure to simplify, as Michael puts it, has always existed, right? Bo's talking about the pushback on complexity. And I mean, that pushback comes from discomfort, right? I mean, comfort is privilege, right? In a lot of ways. And so now we find, a kind of generation of talent that is approaching their identities in a way that's far more expansive, right? When I think about, we can all think back to this. Chris talked about from identifying as lesbian to now non-binary. Non-binary visibility is increasing in corporate spaces, but in the past there was tremendous, at least demands for me to cover, right? And so that may have lessened over time. But when I think about my career journey in general, and I talk about this often, being aware of my kind of positionality as a Black, female-bodied, out, queer person, right, on Wall Street, and then in venture-backed startup world, and over time, again, having a tremendous amount of privilege and access. Many of us positioned to, be able to influence and disrupt corporate spaces, but then still knowing that we're going to be discounted in some of the spaces that we enter, some of the spaces that we occupy. And so you think about the degree of complexity, the binary, and if we were to break that down, as it does break down, the construct itself, I think that fragility scares people, right? Because it's a lot easier for you to hold fast to what access and privilege you have than to, have whatever foundation you're standing on a road, because in some cases it actually invalidates the way you've oriented yourself in a corporate space for a very long time, right? And I think what is good, what I have seen kind of change or shift, is this at least attempt within corporate America to take a more intersectional view of D&I efforts in general, right? And to the benefit of Black women, Latina women, Asian women, transgender, non-conforming folks in the workplace. I know what it's like to be the only Black body in the room, to be the only female body person of my title on a desk, right? And then when you begin managing teams, right, then you realize, wait, this might be the first time the individuals in my reporting line have ever reported to a Black person or ever been led by a female-bodied person, right? And that shapes your interactions. And so I think, and it requires a heightened awareness of around how we cultivate culture, how we anchor our interactions in a way that is beyond just managing a book of business, right? It's managing lack of exposure and bias. And I think when you end up disrupting the gender binary, for some, I think that puts them on less solid footing, because it's a lot easier, to be able to categorize, the headwinds, the opportunities for advancement and engagement of key cohorts when you're not looking, and when you do have these constructs that you can just hold close and organize around.
Thanks so much, Linnea. You started to talk about your identity and your professional journey. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more. Particularly curious, as you evolved in your professional trajectory, were there elements of your identity that about which you felt more empowered, sort of the higher level you got, and could be more authentic in your leadership?
It's interesting too, because yes, there was a tremendous amount of covering, and early on, many young professionals or those emerging in their careers, you're focused on output, right? You're focused on offering meaningful contributions to the organization. And so I covered, I straightened my hair as a Black female. I actually have natural hair, hyper feminized. I wore silk blouses and pearls. Dina, I think you remember those days quite vividly.
I think we had those days, yes.
And because again, the binary was very much alive and well. Gender identity was not a topic of discussion in workplace. And that was a way to just eliminate one additional headwind, right, in the interactions. But then, of course, as I advanced in my career, and I was more visible and leading emerging talent and trying to open up space for them in workplace. I decided I'm going to strip away some of that covering. And again, I was in a tremendous place of access at that point. But first it was very small. It was, I'm not going to do any more external speaking engagements for the bank, not dressed like myself, right? And anybody who knows me knows that I, for a long time, had two closets. I had what I called ERGB wear, which is my, menswear, what I wore day in, day out. Then I had my Condoleezza Rice wear, which is what I performed when I went to work. And so I ceremoniously, and I began to present as myself, right? Pocket squares, ties, suits, brogues. And my clients, my colleagues, my teammates, they responded no differently, right? We still were committed to the work, driving alongside one another, and we found so many other ways to connect. But it took some time in my career because those demands to cover did exist. And I'm pleased that non-binary talent and others are able to enter the workplace today, perhaps with a lessened demand to do what I did.
If I can jump in here for a moment and just first of all, thank you for sharing that story. But you bring up a really interesting point about how do people, particularly those people who come from identities that have less social power as a whole, how do we adapt to the environment and the stereotypes that we know we live with, right? And you articulated a really great one, the concept of stereotype threat, right? That, because we recognize, and I mean, I'm becoming more aware of how I've adapted to this, like stereotypes of being a woman of East Asian descent, right? And I always tell people, I don't know if I'm naturally outspoken and very direct and all those things, or I don't know if that's an adaptation to the stereotype threat of the quiet, demure, unassuming Asian female. And so I think one of my trademarks is I'm very opinionated. I'm very outspoken. People know if you hire Bo as your chief diversity officer, she is going to like hold your feet to the fire and never let you off. Is that who I am, or is that who I've adapted to be based on the stereotypes, right? And I think particularly for people who come from communities that we know there are lots of stereotypes, we know there's not a lot of power. What have we done on an unconscious? Because I actually think that stereotype threat is one of the sources of concepts like gaslighting and concepts of like imposter syndrome. All those adaptations that so many of us make to all the forces around us. And so we become what we know is needed to be successful, but we lose ourselves in the process of it. And I feel like that process of losing ourselves becomes the source of so much of that imposter syndrome so many of us feel. Like, I don't belong here. Well, maybe I feel like I don't belong here because it's not actually me that's here. It's a version that's going to be successful. Mm-hmm. And I think that any conversation we have, whether it's about gender or race, ethnicity, or any form of identity, has to actually talk about what Linnea was talking about. What is the journey that we had to get to be successful? Like, what did we have to give up, and how do we regain that power of our own identity in the process? Like, I loved Linnea's story about, I just decided at some point I was going to stop. And the power that I'm sure your career took off after that in a way that you didn't expect. Same thing for me. Like, when I stopped trying to be what people thought, like, my career fundamentally accelerated. And I think, these are conversations that need to be had, and we don't have them enough.
Yeah. You just touched on so many profound points, Bo, and particularly this notion of calibrating yourself and your career in anticipation of stereotypes that may be used against you in some way. I have an image of trying to make it through a maze in which there's total darkness, and you don't know until you've bumped up against something that the wall is there. And I think you're spot on. I think so many of us, our professional identities are a combination of our authentic selves, and then daily, sometimes hourly, minute by minute negotiations, compromises of the self that I think as some of us get more senior, get into a different level of leadership, this is why we have so many, CEOs coming out. Well, what about that journey to that level? So I'd love to turn now to Jen to hear a little bit more about your identity, your career trajectory, and any reactions you have to the comments thus far.
Sure, thank you. I had 20 years of white male privilege, and used it without knowing it. It just was something that was part of my day-to-day experience. But being a trans person and knowing that part of myself that I hadn't expressed yet, you did recognize that in the field that I'm in, which is technology, it's not even. It really isn't. I mean, I believe something like 47, 48% of the population are working women, but only 25% or less are in technology. And I mean, all you have to do is look at the Fortune 500 or the FANG stocks. If you're not in technology, you're at a disadvantage. You really are. Now, there's a lot of other jobs, but still, that's a great way of building a career and being important to your company. So, when I transitioned 6 or 7 years ago at this point, putting together how we would do it and what would be the methodology behind it, because I was a leader at a company where it was going to be something very public, was the whole concept of honoring the dignity of everybody in, not just the individual is transitioning, but recognizing that the people around them had to transition as well, because they were seeing you now with not covering, with a different light. And that could be very difficult for people. There were quite a few conversations. I remember speaking to some women at my company, and they were like, why would you do this? And I was like, what are you talking about? It's who I am. And they're like, yeah, but you're giving up so much. And I was like, whoa, okay, let's have conversations about that and why that's the case. So with me and the roles that I've had, I've tried to show that the femininity or being a woman is not a weakness. It's actually a strength in certain ways, but you've got to fight those stereotypes. Another little anecdote was just literally like a couple of weeks ago, I was having lunch with a friend of mine, and we both happen to be trans. And it's not a dirty secret to talk about the fact that, passing is something a lot of trans people worry about. And, we were talking about it, and her comment was, your only tell that you're trans is you're too confident, that's a masculine trait. And I was like, that's one of the saddest things I've ever heard, that having a sense of confidence is something that you haven't experienced in other women in your life or as role models. And so that stereotype of, always taking the second position or supporting the rest of the organization, that you can't be that leader, that you can't have a sense of confidence in yourself. I just can't see how we can move forward if we can't pull that down as a stereotype.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Jen. I want to move us a little bit into the application of the concepts that we've been talking about. I think that we have a deep appreciation for complexity and intersectionality as people in dialogue here today. And then as DEI practitioners or those in other leadership roles, we turn to some of our tried and true structures, and they're pretty much single identity organizations. So what I mean by that is we are talking about, as Bo mentioned, to talk about quote unquote women often has an invisible parentheses in front of it that means cisgender, white, able-bodied women. And so within an organization, you have a women's ERG, you have an LGBTQ ERG, you may have one that speaks to younger workers. What is the path forward to reconcile this very nuanced understanding that I think so many of us have come to around identity with these tried and true organizational structures, such as ERGs, self-ID efforts, even the role of a chief diversity officer? I think with that, I'd love to start with you, Michael, and then start to go around the table.
Yeah, it's a issue that we've been facing, right, for a few years now. And we've had some companies experiment here around ERGs and whether the ERG structure is still relevant, or BRGs. And particularly at this time, having been through the most significant crisis probably since the civil rights era, and I'd argue that we're still in, I've been wrestling with this, quite honestly, because up until that point, I'm just going to be really candid here, I was of sort of the mindset and heading down a path where, hey, it was really about inclusion, expand the tent, it's about everyone. And this period has made me very introspective and said, have I been part of the problem? Have I been part of the problem around creating such an expansive tent that we don't create the space to have the tough conversation for specific diverse communities that we know have been marginalized to a point where they're not making progress? And all the data suggests that. Let's just be candid. And so where I'm at today is I think that the ERG structure and the notion of organizing around identity is something that is valued. But it's an and, it's not an or. And so what I mean by that is that these groups have a responsibility to partner with other groups. And I think as D&I practitioners, it's my responsibility to create the structures and reinforcement mechanisms to encourage that. Our ERGs have a responsibility to have a certain percent of their programming be cross BRG. So that way we're seeding some dialogue together. And this is a fine point because we can't force collaboration, but we can create the mechanisms to incentivize groups to come together so that they start to discover their intersectional approaches and start to explore that in an organic way. And I think we have to do that without losing focus that, let's just be candid, we need to focus on Black and Brown representation, and that is ever more important today as it was yesterday. And if we've been part of the issue that has resulted in this situation, then we need to course correct.
Thank you, Michael. I see energy coming from several of you. Who would like to jump in next? Chris or Linnea, perhaps?
You know, I'll always jump in.
Sure.
From an ERG BRG perspective, I mean, this is one from the beginning when we started our LGBT program. Even Allies was a huge piece of what we did, and that concept never really grabbed on in the other employee resource groups. And I think we're seeing much more interest in that aspect now, and seeing and really looking to the LGBT groups to say, how have you been so successful in engaging allies and truly activating them to be supportive and helping to motivate things. So I think the ERG pieces really do play a big piece. We are seeing incredible push, and frankly, I lead our employee resource group networks. We have 300 chapters of all of them across the US and Canada. And one of the key things that we've put out is you have to have joint events every year. So much like Michael was saying, we're seeing a lot of that. You can call it the tribal need being still met by having groups being able to still come together, but in teaming with other groups, then seeing the similarities between each other, but also the differences and being able to draw those out, call those out, and work through them. So the joint events to me are the key thing around the BRGs. But I think you also need to take a look when you talk about DEI structures, really the impact of our benefits. And how those structural components of those types of things also play into some of these things. So, for example, when you talk about maternity leave, you can't have maternity leave anymore. You really need to be moving more towards that parental leave. But you also have everyone asking the same questions. Will this impact my career? What do I need to worry about when I come back? How I come back? And when you can spread that empathy out around, it then starts to really help others support others as well.
And I would say we look at this when we're doing our calibration of our associates, how well are they doing? What are they doing? And one of the things that we actually had to put pressure on, and I have done, is that we have, leave for the birth of children. If one of my male colleagues is not taking that time, I sit down with him and go, this is a benefit we're giving you. This is something that you should take advantage of. And we can work with you on it. But at the same time, it is a fact that if your female colleagues are taking off 10 weeks, 3 months, several years out of their career, it does affect them. And therefore, trying to balance that out between the different genders that you have in your organization is extremely important so that it's not looked at a detriment to your career that you were gone for a period of time just because you decided to have children or to take care of a parent or anything else that might pull you out of the workplace.
Mm-hmm. I want to touch on something that Michael said really early on about sort of his own introspection around, diversity and inclusion to a certain extent, this idea of like this big tent idea versus others. And it made me think about I think the oft, used metaphor around diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance or something like that. So I think anyone who knows me knows that I have I loathe that metaphor to the umpteenth. I just think it's fundamentally problematic because it creates this fundamental hierarchy of diversity, inclusion over diversity, somehow diversity is a lesser state. And I always tell people, no, in fact, actually, if you have a lot of different people in your organization, but you don't have inclusion, you don't actually have diversity. What you have is just basic quota systems. And so I really like, this is an evolution for me. I've been doing this work for 20 years, and it's an evolution for me where I'm like, no, actually representational diversity is your goal. Like, it's truly your goal. And you should never dismiss that. Like, you should diminish the importance of representational diversity in all that we do. And, I think it's okay to have these single identity groups. Like, it's kind of goes back to like, Beverly Tatum's like book, like, why are the Black kids sitting together? Like, when you come from an identity that is marginalized in one way or another, and you are particularly underrepresented in an organization, you need that safety of otherness, right? But in the process, and I think, people are touching on this, in the process of creating that space for yourself, you don't want to exclude other people, right? Like, we know that women's groups are largely white women's groups, right? We know that as a general rule, like, people of color, gender, non-binary women don't feel safe. It's a cis, straight, white women's group. And so I think, all this to say is, I think as we talk about all of these concepts and topics, people have to get more comfortable actually using language and actually like calling things out. Like, I remember I was leading a training on diversity and inclusion, and I actually had an ER investigation launched because someone said, Bo uses the term Black too much in her training. Because I was talking about like how Blackness really impacts people's lives and impacts their careers. And someone said, she just used the term too much. And I remember talking to an investigator going, well, how do I talk about race and ethnicity without talking about Blackness? Like, truly. And one of the big controversial things that we've, not so controversial, but it was when I first said it, I said, I'm creating an internal metric that looks at Black female thriving in Uber. And that's going to be the most important metric that we have at Uber. And I track all the other things that you're supposed to, but I said, I'm going to create one for Black women. And I said, frankly, we can get rid of all of our other metrics. And everyone at Uber's like, what? You're going to get rid of, I'm like, I'm not going to get rid of all of our metrics, but I could. And I could just have that one, are Black women thriving at Uber? Are we attracting them? Are we promoting them? Are we retaining them? Because I said, frankly, in the hierarchy of society, Black women are the most marginalized. And I said, if I can create a strategy where Black women thrive in an environment where Black women can thrive in our company, I know by default we're getting something else right for everybody else, right? And I think in all of these discussions, we have to be willing to just call it out. And I think sometimes, right, use the language of diversity, not inclusion, but use the language of diversity to really talk about the hardness of this, right? Like Jen talked about like the complexity of caregivers, right? Like, let's really, like, we talk about how difficult the pandemic has been on caregivers, but we don't really talk about what makes it so complicated, right? We know that we say, women have been disproportionately impacted by COVID, but we don't really talk about how they've been disproportionately impacted. Like, and I think as a community of practitioners, as a community of people who are interested, like, let's really like talk. And I think that's sometimes what gets lost in all of these conversations is the hardness of it and really articulating the hardness of it.
I think both, spot on. I think articulating the hardness is the most difficult challenge. But when we talk about if we're ever going to be able to overcome the difficulty in looking at things intersectionally, beyond kind of this kind of single category cohorts that we're comfortable with. I mean, they're just, in order for us to get to that place, and I love all of the things that, Chris, Michael shared, we have to acknowledge first that barriers to advancement exist, right, for some groups. We have to be able to acknowledge that at the individual level, at organizational levels, right? And Michael mentioned crisis. Obviously, during this time of crisis, you have to also acknowledge disproportionate impact. And that too is more than just in generalities, like really drill down to the differences, right? I think it all really boils down to us being better allies to one another across difference, something we can all do. I like Chris saying that spreading empathy around. And it's acknowledging that the tent might not sufficiently provide cover for everyone, right? We talk about these big tents. At Coquel, obviously research is what we do. And, over the past, kind of couple of quarters, we've come out with a study around being Black in corporate America, but also several studies around belonging. And obviously during, early days of the pandemic and kind of current experiences, we've looked at employees and their experiences in workplace, virtual or otherwise. And so from belonging standpoint, LGBT employees are more likely to feel, out of place, anxious at work compared to non-LGBT employees, especially in this virtual environment. But again, then we look at the data and we see that this is amplified and compounded at the intersections of race and gender, right? Black and Latinx employees are 5 times and 4 times as likely to report having a family member die from COVID, right? We talk about caregivers even. Looking at women, yes, they're disproportionate impact, but 70% of Black women said that they are doing majority of that additional load of taking versus 44% of white women that we looked at, right? Maybe it's, single parent homes, whatever the composition, but there are ways to drill down at the intersection to see, okay, what barriers exist to the advancement of talent? What barriers exist that, might have impact on the lived experiences of people who work? I mean, it's one of those things. Visibility is a challenge. We have to be able to admit these things. Black professionals are less likely to have access to senior executive advocates, like the end, right? We know that at Coquel in our research, we saw that 1 in 5 Black professionals say that not a single senior manager knows them by name. Manager, right? And then of course you ask, about, the envisioning someone of their race or ethnicity in a top job. Literally 1 in 5 say they could never envision a representation of themselves in the C-suite or a CEO, right? And it's one of those things where you have these intersections matter. We talk about the big tent. It is important, but at the same time, in some cases, it doesn't address, the realities that do exacerbate inequity in the workplace. And I think it's something that we need to be able to admit. We need to be able to acknowledge how, intersections of race, class, gender impact our teams, and, kind of call out what we haven't done.
Yeah, I want to build on that because I think, to Bo's point and Linnea's, and really everyone's, there are proof points that, solving for the one is for the benefit of the many. And this community, when I say this community, I mean the LGBTQ plus community that's listening to this. We have been on the front lines of that. And I'll give you a point and why I'm reassured and confident that we can take this forward. For a large part of the conversation, it was our community pushing the needle around parental leave and having a more inclusive parental leave for organizations. And inside of HPE, we've got 6-month parental leave. It's for domestic partners. It's for LGBTQ plus individuals. It benefits cisgender, straight, gay, everyone. And we really took a holistic approach. And part of that, a big part of that, just to be candid, and it's not just in our organization, in many, was because of many of you listening to this that are part of the LGBTQ plus ERG and pushing the needle. And guess what? That 6-month parental leave, 69% of men are taking it. So solving for the one benefits the many, right? It benefits for the majority and marginalized communities. We also have part-time leave. Interesting, part-time leave, when you come back, 75% women are taking it. We also have wellness programs. Every third Friday, it's up to you. Figure out what you want to do in the afternoon, and you figure out what works for you. That's, by everyone that benefits. So there is evidence that we can do this, and we can take the intersectional approach. And I'd argue that this community has been in the front lines of that many times, and we need to again be on the front lines of that. Because going back to my earlier point, you've got a majority of women in CHRO positions that are in a position of power. So including them at the table and continuing to design solutions like this, I think it will benefit. And we can't ignore the individual realities and experiences and barriers to our racial communities and other affected communities.
Thank
And the
you
other
so
thing
much.
I would look at is what is the actual purpose of an ERG, BRG inside of an organization? You know, there is this desire to be with those that are similar to yourself. I will say, working with a lot of younger folks coming into their first or second job, they tend to shy away from them quite often because they don't want to put themselves in one individual box. They don't want to say, oh, I'm part of the women's BRG because I identify as a woman, and then I'm going to exclude all the other ones. So there's so many intersections there that they're not quite sure where to go. And for me, what I would try to work with them on is that there's this whole concept of personal brand building, whereas how many people outside of the people that I work with every single day know of me. And one of the great ways to do that is to become involved in an BRG that may not even be your own identity. And then the other part of that was then looking at our senior leadership and saying, how are you supporting these communities? How are you supporting these groups? You don't have to be an African American to support the African American BRG. You don't have to be. I had lots of friends who were in the Hispanic BRG, and I loved bringing that together with the LGBTQ plus BRG because there were so many really interesting intersections there. But the leadership has to show that these are valuable, and because that way folks can say, I know that leader knows me. And it's not because of my day-to-day job. It's because we met each other at one of these ERG, BRG events. And therefore, there's additional value to start breaking down those barriers that are naturally there in a company.
Thank you so much, Jen. And one of the things I so appreciate about this is we have moved into some of these very practical things that those who are attending Summit can replicate. And so to that end, I would love to hear a bit more from each of you as to how you see strategies that work when it comes to effectively engaging majority men and I think equally important majority women in these conversations. It's one thing to have a conversation about gender and intersectionality across a very diverse panel like this. How do we make this a priority for that able-bodied, cisgender white man who perhaps is cowering a little bit thinking, oh gosh, here comes the blame or an assumption of privilege that I don't think I have, or maybe more generously, somebody who is well-intended but isn't necessarily going to move things off the to-do list to make this a true priority. So what are some strategies you're seeing? And certainly if you want to offer any pitfalls that you think people should avoid in engaging majority men and women in this project?
So I can start off, and actually I'll start off by telling a couple of stories. So I love working with and trying to convert the toughest critic to being the best ally. That's my, if I had a magic power, that would be my power. If someone says, avoid so-and-so, I'm like, my next meeting is with so-and-so. So part of it is, for me, I've really discovered, is helping people realize that they are actually not normative. Meaning, I was having a conversation at my last organization, and I had this really well-intentioned, 50-something-year-old white, straight, cis male come to me and say, Bo, I really want to lean into diversity and inclusion, and I want to become a better champion. But he goes, at the end of the day, I'm not very diverse. And I looked at him, and at the time I was about 8 months pregnant. I was ridiculously pregnant. And I said to him, and he says to me, I don't think I'm very diverse. And he goes, and I said to him very cheekily, I go, get out of town. You're also a 41-year-old pregnant Asian American lady. And he looked at me for a second, and he didn't know what I was implying. And then I said to him, here's the thing. You don't perceive yourself as being very diverse. But to me, as a middle-aged, pregnant Korean American female, you are as strange and weird to me as I am strange and weird to you. There's nothing about you that makes sense to me. And I was being sort of hyperbolic in the way that I was putting this. But I said, you are fundamentally you don't make sense to me in the same way that I don't make sense to you. Now you have the privilege of the rest of the world being designed to validate you, right? So you don't have to see yourself as non-normative. But trust me, you are not normative, right? You just assume you are. And it was like a wake-up call for him, right? And I said, if I created a company with 40, like a bunch of 40-year-old Korean American women, do you know how out of sorts you would feel? And he was like, oh. And I go, now imagine me. He goes, I go, how often do you talk to an Asian American female in executive positions? He goes, you're the only one. I go, exactly. Right? And so it's about having them recognize this, like the relative privilege of like this concept of normalcy. You know, same thing, like even at Uber, you know, one of the very first, you know, I have the privilege at Uber of working very closely with our CEO, Dara. And Dara will tell you, within the first maybe couple of weeks of working at Uber, I asked him in a one-on-one with him, I said, hey, Dara, how do you culturally identify? Because Dara is a very interesting person. For those who don't know, he's actually an Iranian refugee. He came to the US when he was about 13 years old, or a little bit younger than that, I think, not speaking a word of English. And so I asked Dara, I go, how do you identify, Dara? And he goes, I'm just a white man. And I looked at him and I kind of like cocked my head a bit. I'm like, is that how you really identify? And he goes, well, I pass as a white man. And I go, okay, so we've added that complexity. Like he recognizes he passes for a white man, so he has all the privileges of white malehood. But I said, because I said, in the Persian community here in the US, it's a really big controversy about how people of Iranian descent, Persian descent, identify, because some of you who are lighter skinned pass for white, some of you definitely don't. And then you get all of the racism of like being considered an Arabic person, a Middle Easterner, all the ideas about terrorists and so forth, being Muslim, and, most Persians are not actually, follow the Islamic faith. And he goes, oh yeah, I get that. But he said, I'm a white guy. And if you spoke to Dara now and you asked him, how do you identify? He goes, I'm a Persian who has the privilege of passing for white. And that subtle difference, because he then recognizes the privileges that come with whiteness, right? That subtle difference is why Uber has been able to make this bold stances it has around anti-racism, because he's now comfortable with the complexity of race and racism and how it has impacted his life. He recognizes that. I think one of the ways that you work with people who are in the majority, who have the power, whether it's white women, cis straight white women, or men, is to give them a sense of to unveil how much of what they think is just the way things are is actually defined and shaped around their identity. And once they can start seeing their identity as complex, they can then understand the complexity that we're asking them to understand about us. So rather than starting with me, this sounds weird, I start with them. And I place them in the same seat that those of us who have very, intersecting identities have to deal with on an everyday basis. So at least that's the strategy that I've always adopted, and it seems to work. But I'd love to hear what others have done as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump in here. So much of this still just comes down to the conversations. We need to be having one-on-one conversations, and sometimes that's hard. But I know when we first started our LGBT efforts at EY, our sponsor at the time actually started with a simple question to everyone that gave him trouble. And it was, if your kid came to work here at our company and were facing barriers because of who they loved, would you like that? Would you feel as a parent comfortable with your kid having to face trouble and not being judged on their skills and their merits, but being judged because of who they loved? And he had that simple conversation with people that took it back to something they could relate to. And I think we're seeing more and more of that happening in the workplace now, where just like Bo said, we're kind of breaking it down and saying everyone is unique, everyone has a superpower, everyone is special. But finding the ways to share those differences and those similarities is sometimes where we have the challenge. So we need to create those safe spaces that really allow people to be authentic, that allow people to say, hey, I'm helping to lead our LGBT efforts, but I hate pronouns because I'm non-binary, and being able to put some of that stuff out there of things that seem like the norm or like someone should be in favor of or should be challenging, but maybe are difficult, and we have the opportunity to explain why and have understanding built. I think it sounds so simple, but it's so critical.
Building off that, I think in my view, there are two elements around here, and there are behavioral interventions or actions or initiatives or programs, and then there are structural. And I think in organizations, and in my role as a D&I practitioner for a company that's got 60,000+ people all over the world, I have to make the choice around how are we going to drive this through the organization? How are we going to cascade it? And absolutely, we're having more dialogue, right? We've got courageous conversations going. We're now talking about this at every all-employee meeting. It's top of mind. People are going along their own journeys, and that's wonderful. And I applaud that, and that moves organizations. But it doesn't get to the frozen middle. And so then the question is how do you get to the frozen middle? And how do you do that structurally? And so I'm a firm believer that structural and behavioral have to go hand in hand to make it sustainable. And so for us inside of HPE, it really is around embedding, and we have embedded D&I principles into our elements of leadership. And we've done it in a way that's built into the fabric. So we're not using those words because sometimes those words actually meet resistance right across the organization. We're also calling it out explicitly as well in certain areas, but it's woven into everything, and these are simple principles, but then the rubber meets the road around an expectation that every leader, every people leader, we will start assessing as part of their performance next year. And so we'll actually get real data around how are they performing against this objective. And I do think that that's important because you can't get around the slightly cliche, but ever more true, what gets measured gets done. And so conversation plus measurement, trusting with also, reinforcing and making sure that folks are doing what they say they're going to do is imperative. Because to Lisnea's point, you still have a vast majority of individuals that are being led by people managers that have a varying degree of responsibility who are saying, my manager didn't even mention George Floyd's killing. Why? Why didn't they realize that I was in an issue? Or my manager doesn't even feel comfortable, doesn't even know the acronym LGBTQ+. So we have to have these reinforcement mechanisms as well as the behavioral, in my view.
I agree with Michael completely. In addition to, the importance of conversation and to Bo's point, I love the idea of giving them a sense of complexity around their own identities. I think ownership is absolutely critical to drive in, right? Because accountability and measurement all of a sudden become elusive when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, right? And so I think for majority men, and we can say majority women as well, we need to let them know that they too are a part of this movement, right? And critical partners if we're going to have any meaningful change. At COCL, we recently launched a piece of research focused on majority men and their sense of belonging and views on D&I. And we grouped them into three archetypes: true believers, persuadables, and detractors. When I tell you a lot came up in the study, especially in the qualitative, whether it was, majority men who felt, that this work is somehow zero sum or a form of reverse discrimination, to, the persuadables who made up about 48% of the sample who just weren't sure where they fit into the narrative, right? To Bo's point, assuming that they're normative. And so this work obviously doesn't apply to them. But since we don't have time, if I were to just focus on the true believers, this is about 42% of the sample. These are majority men who say that they believe D&I is very or extremely important. They're leaning into learning. When you look at the data, though, you clearly see what doesn't work, right? We realize now that you can't really allow engagement to be an opt-in. The structural component that Michael is talking about is so important. We saw that among true believers who we would expect to be the most engaged. There was a disconnect between what they said they believed and the actions they were willing to take, because nearly half of them had never been involved in any D&I efforts at their company. And the most common reason was lack of time. And we all know in corporate speak, that means translates to this is not important. And so to the extent that you can weave it into corporate culture, you can weave it into performance, so that leaders know this is a part of the remit, right? This is a core competency of leadership. I think that is when that's when we get to peak engagement, right? Goals should be set, progress should be measured, and leaders should be held accountable, just like they would for any other organizational priority.
And I completely agree with that, because like you said, if you can't measurement, you can't fix it. You just can't. You need those measurements in place. And I know that quite often quotas have a dirty word attached to them, that we would somehow be trying to find people who are unqualified simply to hit those numbers. And that's simply not the case. In technology, we have this concept of the leaky pipe, which is, it's roughly 50-50 of young elementary school, middle school kids who want to be interested in STEM, science, technology, and then we start losing young women early because they don't see people like them succeeding. And if they do happen to get into business, then the number one reason why somebody then leaves corporate America is not because they want to go and have a baby, which is a common thing that you would hear. It's because they don't feel like they're getting the support nor the ability to move forward in their career in the company that they were brought into. The issue is, if I already have a small population that I'm choosing from in order to hit my goals, then I can always have the excuse of, well, you can't find them. They're just not there. They're nowhere to be found. And so, the way that I'm looking at it now is that I need to find those people that I know are smart, that are driven, that they want to succeed, and then I can teach them how to do their job. If we're always going to be like, you have to hit every checkbox for every skill and your history in the workplace, yes, it's very easy not to find that person that hits those numbers. But until you make that an impetus for leadership. And that's the thing is, go to any leader, go to any Fortune 500 leader and say, is diversity important? Do you think that is, really important for your particular business? I can't think of one that would say no, because we recognize the power of diversity. And in particular, like I'm in banking, our population should somewhat represent the populations that we serve. And so from a gender perspective, we should be somewhat even. So I had a really interesting discussion with an executive, I'm not going to say who, at a certain point saying, I'm recognizing that we're not hiring enough women, that we're not promoting enough women. I think that in order to change that leadership should be dinged if they're not hitting certain numbers or at least moving in the right direction. And his response was, well, no, I wouldn't ding them, but I would maybe give you a boost if you did, which showed me it was not a priority. It was not something that they were interested in doing, even though D&I was a corporate pillar of ours at the time. So, I think you can, I don't want to say force it, but you can put the things in place that at least start us moving in the right direction when it comes to.
Can I just jump in here? Because something Jen has said, it really and I think it's very powerful what she said. This notion of people trying to defend, support D&I, but then also defend that we can't somehow lower the bar, right? And we've all, as practitioners, we all as D&I, people who care about it very deeply, we've all heard the statement, I fundamentally support D&I, but I don't want to lower the bar. And that statement is built upon the notion that we have established a high bar and that we're somehow diminishing it. But I always turn around and I always flip it back and say, prove to me that the bar is high to begin with, because you've never actually proven that. And actually that's this idea that we have a high bar in diversity and inclusion diminishes it, is fundamentally a cultural and racial supremacy notion. If we have a system where the majority of people who are coming in are white men, white women, then, and you believe that the bar is actually high, then what you're saying inadvertently is white men and white women are superior in some intrinsic way. They're smarter, they're harder working, their culture is somehow supreme to all others. And most people wouldn't defend that position, saying white men and white women, cis, straight, are somehow like supreme to all others, right? But they will say, I support diversity and inclusion, but I don't want to lower the bar. Well, you're implying that bringing in more women, particularly non-binary women, bringing more people of color, diminishes the bar. So you're saying those cultures are inferior, and we just have to find the good eggs in those cultures. When put that way, everyone backs away from that statement. I support diversity, but I don't want to lower the bar. And I would say, and this is me maybe because I've been doing this work for as long as I have, I would say it's okay to start pushing this conversation and actually being as blunt as that. Because we all know that around the world globally, these ideas of cultural racial supremacy are starting to gain traction again. And I think it behooves us as practitioners, as people who care deeply, to just confront them and really push it and say, are you pushing a supremacist notion by saying that? And the work is as hard as that, but it is necessary as that. And I think I've been through that cycle in my own career of thinking of D&I as this, approaching D&I in this very polite way. And I'm kind of tired of the politeness of it. I want to acknowledge, I don't want to be rude, but I also don't want to be impolite.
Right. And there's a thing called the success fallacy, which is, I've succeeded and I pulled myself up by my own bootstraps, and therefore, whatever it is that made me successful will make other people successful as well, because I need to find people with those same circumstances. And quite often we don't mix enough with other folks to see their successes. And so, I am by default, by being successful, should be the pinnacle of what we should be aiming for. And therefore we should be aiming our workplace and our workforce towards me. And I don't think it's as calculated as that. But it's very common, because I would go into certain meetings and go, I think you're failing with your strategy if everybody around the table looks exactly like you. But it's easy for you to find people who look like you because that's what you value. You value their background because it reflects the appropriateness of your success. Because if they have the same background and now they're succeeding, it shows that I wasn't just a fluke or a mistake or a bit of chance that happened. And if we're already out of whack with our statistics, that's a self-feeding cycle that you've got to break that cycle.
Yeah, I mean, to Jen's point, the myth of meritocracy really makes it difficult to see bias. That is a reality. But it is one of those things we're talking about, this high bar. And, I believe that the business case for diversity that I know so many leaders and, partners of mine over the years still are confronted with, it too is grounded in the belief in superiority of, white bodies, cisgendered white male bodies in business. Because again, on one hand, we all know what you need to compete in a rapidly changing business landscape. You need diversity of thought. You need dynamic athletes, and you're strategically impaired if you don't have it. But by continuing to ask, what's the business case for this? Well, you could turn that around and say, well, has anyone ever asked the economics, the business case for having cisgender white men hold every seat in leadership? No one's ever had to defend that. So, why is it that we have to make this investment of time and prove worthiness for, women and underrepresented groups of color to also have a seat and contribute in the same ways? It's one of those things where I've been surprised that the business case is still there, and they're really great ways to lean into innovation, lean into kind of productivity, really activating your workforce. Now that's an inclusive way of talking about the business case. But when it actually comes to let's show the numbers, let's show the economics, I think it's completely flawed, And I think it is definitely rooted in a belief that some bodies are superior to others.
Thanks so much, Linnea. We have just a few minutes left, and clearly this panel could be a multi-part panel, and don't be shocked if you hear from me for parts 2, 3, and 4 over the coming months, because there is so much to discuss here and unpack. But if I could, in our closing here, I would love for each of you to share just 1 or 2 things that are concrete that members of our global out and equal community can do to advance this more evolved conversation about gender, intersectionality, and inclusion within their workplaces. So why don't I start with Chris?
Sure, that's the hard one you just gave me there. Now, I think that the key thing that people can do to take away is really focus in on the changing demographics and be thoughtful of how you use gender in policies, your benefits, and everything you do. And I say that because when you look at the dynamics right now, you're seeing more people who identify as non-binary, you're seeing more bisexual and pansexual identification. And the majority within the LGBT community right now is not always as accepting as they should be of these different identities. And when you see the numbers increasing, we need to make sure we're understanding what are the needs of that demographic, what are the ways that we can be more welcoming, and how best do we create a more welcoming workplace and overall society. But a lot of that comes down to gender and our definitions around gender and how we work around gender. And the more we can neutralize the language that we use around gender, the more welcoming that it can be.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
Michael, do you want to share 1 or 2 things that folks can do to actually further this along?
Sure. I talked about ERGs earlier, and I think that a key member of an ERGB team should be someone focused on intersectionality. Because if we don't make a very deliberate point of talking about these issues and very purposefully engage, for example, with our women's network and have a conversation about gender and pick a topic. I mean, the easiest topic that comes to mind is parenting. By no means is it the only, right? But it's a topic that includes more individuals in the conversation and gives us the opportunity to explore the intersectional approach, as well as highlight the unique experiences of those that identify across the spectrum of how we define gender today.
Thanks, Michael. Linnea.
When thinking about gender in the workplace, I would encourage the out and equal community to really think about being intentional and leveraging what we coined the Audit, Awaken, Act, right, framework. Basically, as an individual, but also as organizations, audit your current state. Really understand the dynamics at play that get in the way of equitable outcomes for women in the organization. And then once you awaken to whatever those systemic realities are, and there's a desire to do something about it, then act in an informed, intentional way, right? Very intentional as it relates to hiring, development, promotion. But first, you have to do a little bit of introspective work to understand exactly your point of departure.
Thanks, Linnea. Jen?
I would go with, recognizing, especially when you look at the intersectionalities that almost everybody have, that we are all different. We are all special. We have different backgrounds, different histories. We have different ways that we interact with the world through privilege or lack thereof. And I would say, be proud of that. Recognize that as a superpower. If we were all exactly the same, it'd be very difficult to carve your own way in the world. And especially if you're a person of privilege, of leadership, I think it's incumbent upon you to self-identify in as many ways as you possibly can, so that somebody who is being aspirational can go, oh, there's somebody like me. There's one chance there, at least, that I can work my way up and succeed in life. And the other part of that is, don't accept old excuses. Don't allow the same old excuses again and again as to why we can't accomplish our goals to stop you. Turn it around and say, we're creative. How can we accomplish this? And even if it's completely off the wall ideas, at least try those new try those new ideas. There are no bad ideas if you're trying to do the right thing. So please use your superpower of being uniquely you to accomplish those goals.
Thank you so much, Jen. And lastly, Bo.
I'll keep it really easy. A lot of people have talked about representation, about self-identification. The single greatest thing that any of us can advocate for, if you're a part of a BRG, ERG, if you're a leader, is to ask your organization to expand their global self-ID. How many of you work for a company where you can self-identify based on gender identity, gender expression? How many of you work in a company where you can identify your racial identity outside of the United States? Most companies have it in the US. They don't have it anywhere because the work is too hard. How many of you have the ability to track a socioeconomic background in childhood, right? We actually, one of the earliest things I did at Uber, it took us 9 months because we had to really work rigorously to adhere to the EU privacy laws there. But we expanded our global self-ID to 8 different categories, and we asked all 8 categories in 67 countries, except for places where it's not allowable. So we asked race and ethnicity in 60 some odd countries. We asked gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation in about 60 countries, except for the countries where it's illegal. That's the single greatest thing, because once you start getting that data, and then you can disaggregate things like engagement survey data, you can disaggregate attrition, retention, promotion by these different categories. It's a whole other world, because right now a lot of these topics around the LGBTQ community, it's easy to ignore them because there's no data. You're like, well, our LGBTQ community is feeling this well, and you're like, do you have any data to back that up other than anecdotal? But if you can actually disaggregate your engagement survey by sexual orientation and gender identity, that's a whole other ballgame. So the simplest thing you can do is just advocate for an expanded GSID.
Thank you so much, Bo. Thank you to this incredible panel for the insights and the great intellect and also heart that you bring to the work that you do. We are really, really fortunate to have each of you with us at Summit today. So thank you again.